Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Hello. For those of you who don't know me, I am Professor Michael Arthur. I'm the President and Provost of UCL. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome all of you to UCL this evening for this annual Lancet Lecture. Just by way of introduction, I thought I should just say a few words about the Lancet Lecture. It's a collaboration between, of course, a world-leading health journal, the Lancet, and one of the world's leading multi-faculty universities, yes, you guessed it, UCL. It's part of our series that really relates to one of our grand challenges. And our grand challenges are our big multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary activities across the university. There are four of them, and the one that we are focused on tonight is, of course, global health. So this annual lecture is now in its 15th year, and we always invite a leading figure to discuss areas of global health interest. And the intention of this lecture is absolutely to be agenda setting, to lay out the key issues at stake in global health, and to provide a rallying cry for action. So past lectures have involved speakers of the highest academic and political calibre, and tonight is, of course, no exception. But before we introduce our distinguished speaker, it's my pleasure to invite my good friend, Dr. Richard Horton, editor of the Lancet, up to the stage to introduce our speaker. Richard, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody, and first let me thank Michael for his introduction, and also I'd like to thank University College London. This year we've launched two what I think are important pieces of work, commissions, first on climate change and planetary health, and the contribution of University College academics to that, and I see Georgina Mace in the front row here, who is on both commissions, has been truly extraordinary. And I think that those two pieces of work show very clearly that Michael's right in talking about a world-leading institution. Indeed, I think UCL has shown such exemplary leadership over recent years in addressing some of the most pressing issues of our time. So let me turn to an individual who's been at the center of one of those most pressing issues of our time, Amina Mohammed, as you see her name up there. Nigeria's new Minister for the Environment as of 24 hours. Now, if I had been appointed a Minister for the Environment, or Minister for anything, 24 hours before coming to London to give a lecture, even at a world-leading university such as UCL, I might have found another reason to be somewhere else, to worry about my new portfolio. But it's a tribute to Amina, her professionalism and her commitment to the issues she's going to talk about this evening, that she's with us, and we are truly privileged. Her new appointment is actually a fantastic opportunity because for over 3 years now, she's been Ban Ki-moon's Assistant Secretary General and Special Advisor on post-2015 development planning. There is no other human being in the world who has had a better ringside seat at the negotiations that are going to shape not only the future of the next 15 years to 2030, but well beyond in terms of human progress. And it's wrong to even say that. She's not been a spectator, and she's not even been a referee. She's been a diligent, strong, and active, indeed activist, protagonist, arguing the case for the transformative power of this idea of sustainable development. I've seen her speak at several health conferences now over recent years, but please remember, health, as absolutely important as it is to the future of the planet, is only one of 17 SDGs. So imagine the scope and the scale of her work and the challenge of her work over these past 3 years. And now we can say achievement, as of September when these SDGs were finally signed in New York. Her energy and her passion are compelling and indeed winning qualities in a debate where too often minimum progress is seen as the inevitable compromise of agreement. Amina is a Nigerian citizen. 30 years she's had of experience working across civil society, public and private sectors. She has previously assisted the President of Nigeria in responding to the Millennium Development Goals. She's the founder of her own think tank. She's taught in universities, worked at foundations. In 2007, she was inducted into Nigeria's Women's Hall of Fame, and this year won the Ford Family Notre Dame Award for Human Development and Solidarity. When she was asked in December last year what development issues she felt most strongly about, she said one word: leadership. Will the world see the leadership we need to succeed in achieving the SDGs? I can't think of another person who better exemplifies the values of leadership, her personal leadership in achieving the agreement around the SDGs, than Amina Mohammed. Ladies and gentlemen, we're so privileged to have you with us this evening to hear Amina Mohammed speak on the subject of the new Universal SDGs for 2030, from vision to action. Please welcome Amina.
Thank you. I promise you that wasn't me he was talking about. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Provost Michael Arthur. I just met you, and thank you for having me here, and thank you, UCL, and everyone that's here, because this is evening time, and I suspect you have lots of things to do. Then, anyway, I'm going to attempt to try to make your evening one that's worthwhile, and perhaps not talk so much about health, but set the context for which health has to succeed in, and for which the context itself will inform what happens to health. I'm going to start by just situating some of my experiences. I know everyone in this room has a story, and I think it is the stories that we have, if we bring them to the workplace, we bring them to the things that we do and inform them, then I think we really see the courage of our conviction in the work that we do. And when I first started looking at how to shape an agenda that the Secretary General had asked me to come and do almost 4 years ago, I thought, where do we start? This is member states, 193 of them are going to shape the agenda, and their diplomats. And this is a far cry from the experts that, and men, might I say, who sat in the basement and prescribed for us the MDGs. And I started really to look at the experiences that I had gone through. What would we do differently? Not just the experience of the MDGs, but let's just start with the best things I've done in my life, and that's have 6 children. 2 of which are not my birth children, and 4 that are. And I started with my first birth child, working hard enough that I was on my way to a project site, and I started off doing project management and engineering, and forgot that, sometimes at 7 months pregnant, you shouldn't be on the road for 9 hours and not have anywhere to go and pee. And so set off that morning, and really was the wrong thing to do. Found myself in a private hospital, which we all think is probably the best thing to do in Nigeria. Not go to the public hospitals, but they're probably in some cases as bad as the public hospitals. And there I was with a doctor who said, well, he had examined me, and he did, and he broke my waters, and I was 7.5 months, and that was the end of that. So he said, well, you need to stay here now for another 1.5 months before you have your baby. You can't go anywhere. That's not possible. So he induced, and I went into labor, and what was really horrific was that there was this wonderful theatre, and everything was painted very nicely, and it had this incubator in it, but it didn't work. And I was thinking, wow, okay, I'm going to have a prem, and how is she going to survive? Anyway, she came, and she did survive, as we say in Nigeria, by the grace of God, because there isn't anything that she didn't have that once she came out. And now she's bigger and taller than I am, and people often refer to her, Samira, is that your sister? And I'm thinking, great, and she's thinking, not so good. But that wasn't the end of it. I still went back to the same hospital for the second one. And she did, full term, and off I went into the hospital. But they didn't have the theatre this time, so I went into a side room. And I remember going into that side room thinking, I know that this bed is really filthy and full of germs, and what am I going to do? I'm going to have this baby. And had Nadine, and they took her away. And my brother-in-law came along, and he said he was coming to the room to see if I was okay. And later he told me that he stopped in the hall because on this stool there was this little baby wrapped up. And she was just in the hallway. And the nurse had gone off to get something, and there was this little baby on the stool. And I thought, wow, if it had fallen off, what would have happened? Again, a private sector health facility that wasn't functioning. So the third baby, I decided to go to a teaching hospital. And I have a very dear friend and sister in here, and I know she's worked in that hospital, Chinese Otigba, doctor. And I had this consultant, gynecologist, because I thought that's what I needed. And she, so she took me through, and then when I got ready to come, I have to tell you, culture played a part in never mind the English that I'm speaking now, but culture often plays a part in what we do when it comes to childbirth. So I listened to my aunts who said, just don't go to the hospital until you're really ready to have the baby. And don't forget, don't make any noise when you're having it, because, it's not a good thing for a Fulani woman to do. So I went at the last possible minute. And I got in there. And the experience of that public hospital has really played a big part in some of the voices that I brought to the table, but often when I've shouted about systems and what the value of a midwife in a hospital to this whole agenda. And it was to see that I was lined up along the other sardines with very big stomachs in this room. And one lady next to me, and I was thinking she was about 19 years old, she was huge. And I thought, how's she ever going to have a baby? And I forgot about my labor pains. And I was asking her, well, who's she come with? And she said, oh, just her husband. And she just had this small wrapper. I had this suitcase, privileged woman, 6 of this and 6 of the other, and made sure everything was there. But she had nothing. So got off my bed and shared that with her. And then went into the theatre to have my baby, third one. My husband was in the car park, and he'd wound the windows up and put the music really loud. He wasn't coming into the theatre. But I think the lesson here was that, as I came to have the baby, I realized the value of the midwife. My consultant gynecologist didn't have a problem to deal with, but it was the midwife that was delivering me. And I was about to deliver, and she said, I've just got to go now because another lady's come in, and she's come, and she doesn't, her baby has died, and I've got to evacuate her, and I have to go. And I just said, absolutely not. I looked at my consultant gynecologist with her high heel shoes looking really nice, and I thought, no, I need the midwife. Just wait, just give me 5 minutes. And I was able to have my baby in that 5 minutes. I didn't play around with, when she said push, I pushed. Out Iman came, and then I wanted to go home. I said, no, I've got to go home. No, you've got to be here at least 12 hours. So off I went into the ward, and I didn't want to go into a private room because I was afraid if anything happened, there'd be nobody to pay attention to me. So I went into the ward. And going into the ward was another lesson. And they thought that I was a special person, so I should go to the end bed. I wouldn't be near the rest of them. And I went in with my baby. I sat on the bed, and the first thing that said good morning, because it was about 5 o'clock in the morning, was, like 1 million mosquitoes, good morning. And I thought, wow, okay, now what do I do? Hanging on to her, and then having to go to the toilet, and somebody saying, I don't think you can go with those shoes, you need to take my slippers. And in my language, takabrodi is step on bread. So it's plastic slippers that are this high, like a loaf of bread. And the reason for that was that the facilities didn't work. That you walked in, that there was water all over the place, there's everything else as well all over the place. And so you were really trying to imagine, how is it possible that after having a baby you go into facilities with a lack of sanitation like this? That was the second lesson for me, have Iman. Anyway, last but not least, I can't tell you that I didn't have a cesarean, I did, that was the last one. And that was about, again, a private facility, thinking that I had it all right, and going in there. First of all, to find that I'd have to have a cesarean because Bilal was lying horizontally. And that was fine, and I went in and then prayed a lot. I pray a lot when I get into trouble. But by morning time, his head had turned down. So I thought, oh, this is amazing. So I was told, let's just, what do you say, sweet remembrance? Yeah, that's what it is. That's what he did. And then he said, you just wait a bit, and we'll need to get some drugs. The drugs weren't available. They had to go to Lagos. Off I went. home 3 days later. Waters broke and I went into hospital. And they were in church at that time in hospital. So I was waiting for them to finish service because I thought I was going to have the baby any moment. And then they said, no, sorry, you can't. He's gone sideways again. And have to go for cesarean. A cesarean in a hospital that didn't have the facilities that we thought we had, but survived that. And I just take this time to talk about each one of these experiences. Many, 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 many hundreds and thousands of women in Nigeria over the years have never survived. Somehow, by, as we say, the grace of God, I did. But it's these experiences that I reminded people through the process that we argued what we needed for the health goal, not to forget the reality. That very often these realities are not visible to us because we've come away with the expertise to say that we know what's best for developing countries. And so really to take lessons from that. And I hope that every one of you will take your stories into the implementation as I go through this lecture. That's one of the things I'd like to talk about is, as we say, moving from that vision to action. Introducing dignity and the worth of all of us humans, our humanity, really is spoken to in the United Nations when we talked about we the peoples of the United Nations, determined first to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women of nations large and small. To establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. We the peoples, and these are the opening words of the United Nations Charter, and that's really what we meant to convey for the new universal agenda. They're very simple, they're visionary, they emphasize dignity and the worth of our humanity as the fundamental cornerstone for the United Nations and our community, our family, our global family. 70 years after the creation of the United Nations, on the 25th of September, we will remember that. I think I remember more 2 months earlier where we managed to succeed in agreeing the agenda, and I will talk a little bit about the process because often people don't understand what goes in to a 3.5-year process of trying to agree what, when you see it today, you probably nitpick it and pull it all apart and say that's not quite right and why haven't you gone further here? But that process of owning this agenda was agreed by 193 countries at the General Assembly this year. The adoption of a 2030 agenda for sustainable development. And the 15 years we choose to end poverty by was also not guaranteed. Many thought, well, 15 years was too long. Others thought it was too short. But even just 2030 became a subject of debate. But it is a universal compact towards the dignity that we speak about. And it is about one that's people-centered. And it certainly is about being planet-sensitive. And we learned for the first time that sustainable development was going to be much more than just about ending poverty. It was what that meant and what it contained. The 2030 result is one of an unprecedented 3-year long, and it has been transparent. It's certainly been inclusive, an open intergovernmental process in the United Nations that we've ever had. Many people didn't know where the United Nations was or what it was as we went out universally. They knew in developing countries, much in the UK, some of Europe, Africa, and a little bit of Southeast Asia, but really many didn't see the relevance of it beyond what we did with the blueberries in conflict. It has included, and this is why I think its historic effort was collective. It was never about any one person. It was about all of us coming together. It included voices of civil society. We pushed the boundaries of representation. Those who thought they were representative in civil society were challenged by those who said, actually, our voices are not there. Of the elderly, of indigenous people, so many, those with mental health, everyone came up and said, we need to have our voices heard. The business community, who had looked on to the United Nations and the development agenda as charity. Academia as never before, because we really wanted to learn from the MDGs and reinforce that, in fact, science, results-based evidence was important in informing everything that we would do. Regionally, over 100 national and 11 thematic consultations were led by the United Nations and other actors. But even as we did that, we knew that some of those consultations were sterile, as they always have been. We have this agenda that we've written up, and then we ask people to come and consult on it. It's a couple of hours. We never get enough voice in. There's only 3 minutes for this person and 2 minutes for that. And we learned, and every time we went through this, we tried to open it up further because we knew sometimes those people in the room were not with the same old voices with very little ambition. Yet we said, if we want to make this different, the ambition has got to be that the sky is the limit. And that tested a lot of what we did. We wanted young people, and most of you are young in this room today. And so how did we get to them? And we said social media. Remarkable thing about it was people came back and said, but this is incredibly elitist. Not everyone has access to social media. But we saw young people go out to those who didn't have and come back and feed in that information to the social media platforms we had. The My World survey collected opinions of over 7 million, and it's still growing, of people on what the world they wanted. And we struggled with that as well. In many places, we understood the world the developing countries want, the people in developing countries. When we looked sometimes at the surveys that came back, and I remember pressing a couple of interactive screens and asking, I wonder what the people in Sweden want. The people in Sweden wanted water and sanitation, health, education, and I was thinking, that's not Swedish. But that's what they wanted for the developing world. So we still had to come back to talk about a universal agenda and say, what do you really want in Sweden? What do you want to address? Because this is about everyone. I think the warming thing about that was that people still cared about those that didn't have. And so we got that. But in fact, we really needed to ask much, much deeper questions about it. Certainly the largest survey that's ever been carried out globally. So we believe that the new agenda that we have is really owned by governments, but it's also owned by people. And that's important to get to hit the ground running, the transition from the MDGs to the SDGs. It took us almost 5 years on the MDGs to even begin to understand what the acronym was, and sometimes to trying to translate it into our languages. So the 2030 agenda, take you a little bit back, because the MDGs, as successful as they might have been, whether the glass is half full or half empty, it's successful some, really did give us many, many lessons, but it's unfinished business. And the unfinished business was what we tried to make sure we infused into the SDGs, that we didn't leave that behind. Around the world, certainly in 2000, as we looked at what we had and had not done, and I think many of you would have seen the Health for All by 2000, Education for All by 2000, had often failed on most of its targets. And I think bringing together a set of 8 Millennium Goals was very helpful, because it galvanized people around issues that were important. We all knew that no matter what we did, if we attended to those issues, we would save lives, we would make a difference. So the adoption of the MDGs was the first time in history that world leaders decided to really share a set of values, visions, and goals, and draft some of the targets that would guide the multilateral efforts for development. A lot of this I experienced through my role with the MDGs. Again, I participated in some of the framework discussions that we had around implementation. At that time, there was no guide to it, and I put my efforts behind gender and education. But it took a long time to get into our countries. As I said, I didn't address this until 2005, when Nigeria got debt relief, and we decided to put $1 billion a year annually behind trying to do something with the MDGs. It taught me a lot about how not to lose the money to corruption in a country like mine that really faces that on a daily basis. It taught me a lot about trying to spend money at the federal level and get it down to the basic level, which is where the MDGs were. And I can tell you at that particular time, that pipeline was so leaky, the $10 you'd spend up here, you'd get less than $2 down at the local level. So we were really, in the first year, found it very difficult to explain to Nigerians that for want of trying to save the money for them, I couldn't spend it for a year. Because for many people in the system, if that money wasn't going to be spent in business as usual, then it wouldn't be spent at all. So we tried to find ways of leveraging that money to get it down to the grassroots. Anyway, we did 7 long years. We did have impressive results. I think, we saw a reduction in maternal mortality. We saw 40 million Nigerians get access to water. There were certainly many more children in school. But the unfinished business showed that systems were not working in the health sector, so therefore we were still losing far too many women in childbirth and children under the age of 5. Children were getting into school, but they were coming out with less than an education. So we were failing on the quality of education. We weren't looking at the whole system. And of the water that we had delivered to people, how much of it was still being delivered 6 months later? The quality really of the work that went into trying to deliver water and sanitation to our people. So those lessons really did come for us to address them. Globally, we know that the MDGs had resulted in us reducing poverty as we had, but yes, it's about China. And certainly we knew that we never addressed the issues of inequalities. Many say the MDGs didn't react to this, or they didn't respond to that. But I think at that time they were the best tool, the best response to what we were looking at. And I think along the way we had cast them perhaps in stone without thinking of the context as much. And therefore we could, 15 years or even 10 years later, say they were not designed as well as they could have been. Having said that, you'll see of the 17 goals that the first 6 are about our MDGs not being completed, and that's an important part about it. As we started the discussion on the SDGs, new challenges, a really complex world and complex situation, a big decision as to what we're really going to do as successor goals. And member states made up their mind for us. In fact, as we went into Rio in 2012, we never imagined we would come out with a mandate that said member states are going to take hold of this agenda and do it themselves. But what they did do, they said, right, it's not the first time we've discussed sustainable development. In fact, we've been discussing it for a couple of decades. But it's come of its time. And this time we want a universal agenda, one that says we leave no one behind. So it is not about north to south, it's about everyone. We are in a global village where we know that whatever happens in one part of it certainly has implications for the other. And so now the response to that needed to be one that addressed economics, and inclusive economies at that, address the social agenda beyond just looking at the symptoms, trying to address the root causes, and the environment, which had really become a very big issue that we hadn't quite understood. Often in our countries, when we discuss climate change or the environment, people would say, here the donors come with another fad, and lots of explanations as to why we need to take this seriously. Yet presidents were thinking, well, I've got to save more women's life in childbirth, and what is this about? So it really was, I think, quite an ambitious agreement that was reached in Rio. How do we proceed with that? I think when the SG was presented with a fait accompli, that he had to help to guide this and not to prescribe it, so that we did have, at the end of the day, a fully owned agenda. It was a tough decision for him to come to terms with how would the system do this and how would we respond. And so we really did look at the nature of what the backdrop was. We decided that right at the beginning, let's establish what it is that we want to respond to. And responding to a world where, yes, human rights was an incredibly difficult area to be in at that time, even now as it is today, but it had to be something that was mainstreamed through the next agenda, that we had many issues of migration. Poverty was still a big issue for us, inequalities, young people without jobs, health systems that were failing, education systems that were failing. We had to agree what that backdrop was, and I think that in itself provided us, I think, a way forward. I think if we were just going to be talking about the MDGs and a successor set, many wanted MDGs plus. Let's just tweak them. Let's not get any bigger than this, because what we really need is to contain this. But it wouldn't have been responsive. It wouldn't have been responsive to a universal agenda that we needed. And for that began perhaps what was one of the most intense discussions as to what was it that was different in North and South. What was it that we would do to bring the poverty agenda and the environment together, where they went competing, and that we still said the overarching objective would be to end poverty. But I think that once people looked just for unemployment, the crisis in Spain brought it home to us. The crisis around Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, the islands, all of those were things that our member states were able to relate to and bring into the discussion. We also discussed the population issues and the projection of 9 billion that was going to be exceeded in the next 40 years. I mean, for us, that was a big wake-up call to how we're going to find the resources to deal with that. The demand for food, the competition for land, water, all of these exigencies that we would need to address. The environmental challenges, imperatives that were urgent. Yet we were in no hurry to push this through. Certainly 2015 gave us a year where we were going to have 3 important decisions to take. One on the Sustainable Development Goals, but also one on financing them, and of course the conference of the parties, the climate change agreement that we needed by the end of this year. But still, it was not apparent to people why they needed to be concerned about climate change. And that the evidence was there to show us that this clearly was man-made, and I'm often saying that I'm underscoring man in the man-made, because I think if women were in charge, we probably wouldn't have had many of the results that we've had today with climate change. Incredibly serious issues that we are addressing today. The conflicts that we talked about as part of our backdrop, this is a new part of the development agenda that was very contentious. Many people saying, leave the humanitarian crisis and the conflicts to another part of the United Nations. The United Nations stands on 3 pillars: peace and security, the development, and human rights. And so development, we don't need to think about the humanitarian crisis. We don't need to think about people in conflict. But yet we knew that if we didn't, we would be leaving people behind. And we just said that this agenda was about making sure that they were all taken. Perhaps what we needed to do 70 years later was to look at the other 2 pillars to see what the responsibilities were and really push them, because we do know today that the human rights pillar is certainly cracking. We can see that with the atrocities across the world and the denial of rights to women, to children, and young people. But we also see that peace and security, the leadership that we need to take the decisions in ending some of these conflicts, is just not there. And without doing that, then of course the development pillar cannot do what it is supposed to do. I will say that we have recalibrated the development pillar as we're supposed to, but the other 2 are still a little shaky. The nature of the 2030 agenda really is about, as I said, responding to these challenges and a commitment to fulfill the MDGs. It's ambitious. So the universality, which was a great deal of the discussion that we had, did it really have to be about everyone? Could we not just talk about those that don't have? But even those that have, the inequalities in those countries were something that we had to address. And so it is about looking at applying to all countries, developing and developed alike. But it's also about universality and respect to our global commons. We've got a shared responsibility and we have a shared future. And how do we discuss that in a partnership across the world? So it is really, in essence, a commitment to an intergenerational justice for people, that we really need to see that today, yesterday, but certainly going forward. It's transformative because it acknowledges that business as usual is not possible if we want to have a sustainable development path. How do we invest in all these things that we make it so that they are not irreversible? Many of the gains that we have are irreversible because we don't look at the root causes. And so very often what we've done with immunization, for instance, is to say that what is important is the vaccines. And they may be polio, whatever vaccine, the greatest public good that we've had. But if it's not delivered, then it's no good at all. And we saw that with polio in Nigeria, where we had campaigns to go to the villages. But basically, we took those polio vaccines and we sat down and we cracked them open and they went in the ground and we filled the register. We lost millions and millions of dollars that way in the years that we did not really look at the system of delivering on routine immunization. And until we did that, did we then have a chance? And now we can say Nigeria is on the brink of eradicating polio. And that's taken years. So many that came in for a quick fix. Quick fix will not work on systemic issues that have to develop service, that have to deliver on services on the day-to-day basis. And so this transformative agenda really does look at targeting inequality, exclusion to the many main causes of poverty, but it gets into the economy. It gets into a Minister of Finance's room and discussion of the budget, that we're not just a part of the budget, we are the budget. And if you're not going to grow your economy without having a direct impact on the results of people, the human development indices, of the planet, of what you do in your environment, then you've not succeeded. It's not just about GDP growth. It's got to be about what that does in people's lives. It's got to trigger the action that ensures the rule of law and certainly that we defend human rights. It's the first time that we've really talked about the integration. So it is integrated in respect to the multifaceted dimensions of when we talk about our planet, when we talk about economic growth and social inclusion. in recognition that the SDGs are not independent from one another. We had a lot of discussion about 17 goals, again, and having a discussion around people's mandates, their flags, the silos. So really getting into a room and seeing the integration and how one was beneficial to the other was important. How health itself should be a docking station for all the others. And if you talk about any of the others, what health's value is to that, and without it, none of them can be spoken about in that way. The 17 SDGs, they are the heart of the agenda. They illustrate how we can make this narrative operational. They are many. The agenda is more than that. In the end, what did we do? We tried to bring a document to life that every one of you in this room could respond to. Not the usual resolution that we have in the United Nations that probably needs another, probably doctorate to understand it. So we had a preamble that really was about our vision and what we wanted to achieve in 15 years. We also had a political declaration because we really needed to take this back to countries, back to leaders, to say this is what you're actually signing on to, and we can hold you to account. Remember that this is not a legally binding agreement. And so therefore, very difficult to say, I'm going down to enforce it because countries are going to take up this law. We have many experiences of taking conventions that we've agreed down to our countries to enact them as laws. And I can tell you, more than 10 years later, the Child Rights Convention is still having challenges at achieving a Child Rights Act. So it was very important that we got the political declaration so that, in effect, this doesn't have to be legally binding to be one that is taken up by our leaders at all levels. The SDGs themselves and the targets really were there to further operationalize the specificity of the goals. I know there's been many discussions about the targets, and I can see Claire Melamed, who's been with us right from the very beginning, I think from before we even started. So thank you for all the work that you've done. But it was, many of those targets, if you really put them under a magnifying glass, were political statements. They were not targets. And I think that illustrated to us how difficult this process was going to be, and that we really had to remind everyone, not a prescription, a guide, something that people could pick up at the country level and run with. One of the other things that we addressed in responding, so the political declaration, a response was the 17 SDGs, and if people think they're too many, well, try the problems of the world. This was really something that we could do, we thought was the best in response. They won't be implemented 17 goals in silos. They will actually, in fact, cluster themselves around issues, and you'll find that governments will address them in different ways. But the fourth part of this that was really important to us was a means of implementation. If we needed the ambition, then we needed to know that resources were going to be critical to achieve the agenda itself. And many thought about just ODA, the Overseas Development Assistance. 0.7 hadn't been reached, so how could we possibly think that we were going to find the resources for this agenda? And we started from the basis that we have the resources. It was a question of finding how we could unlock them in the different places they were, whether it was private equity or that we needed regulation or special tools to release them and bring those investments to the country level. We were going to do that. And we were going to do better than the MDGs that had the Monterey Agreement agreed way after. So there was no real political commitment to that. Although I must say we did have some decisions that were taken there that we were able to follow up on, like setting the 0.7 target. But this time we agreed that we would have this discussion before. So the means of implementation itself agreed before the goals were. Last but not least was a follow-up framework, a review, the measures, the accountability. If we looked at what we were getting back from everyone involved in this process, it was the need for accountability, for governments that we could trust, that would be held to account. So that final piece, which still is to be concluded, that's the knot we have to tie, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. We had another target that we wanted to achieve, and that was how did we communicate this? And it was incredibly difficult. We started this process with many reports. The high-level panel report that took about 9 months to birth was chaired by the UK, Liberia, and Indonesia, the President and Prime Minister of the UK. That was when we really started to talk about the 5 transformational shifts that we needed to get, and it went through to 6 essential elements of the Secretary General, but finally member states came up with what they call the 5 Ps. And so if they want to talk about what does this agenda deliver, in the context of every one of us here, because I hope that we will think beyond just health. It is about ending poverty. So it's the people, the planet, prosperity, peace, and the partnerships. These 5 Ps are essential to it. And in every one of those goals, we need to take some thought about how we end poverty and hunger in all their forms, what we do to protect the planet, how we ensure that human beings can enjoy prosperous and fulfilled lives in harmony, peace to foster peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, particularly where we're talking about post-conflict. And partnerships means to mobilize what we require to implement the agenda. It is, I think, important here that when we look at the 17 goals, that we don't see them as ones that we sat down scientifically to craft. It is about a guide to what we think is needed to respond to that. And I think here also trying to prioritize or cherry pick the goals would be an effort that would undermine what we have said, which is that as a universal agenda, every single one of them matter. And a country needs to address their priorities within them. And I think that, we will find from the different indices that we have in countries that some people may consider that their issues today are about the slums and the cities and the poverty within that, and may not believe that they have any priority whatsoever when it comes to climate change. But I'm telling you, if you look at the targets and you look at the evidence, you'll find that they are all related. For the health in SDGs, and I'll speak a little about this. I hope we can have an interactive discussion on it. Somebody's timekeeping? Am I talking too much? How many months? I'm going? Okay, right. Here, I think if there were one of 3 goals that we knew we didn't have trouble keeping in this agenda right from the beginning, was health. Health, education, and gender. We knew we were going to have them. But we didn't know what the quality of those goals would be, whether we would just scratch the surface and do MDGs plus, or we would really take a holistic look at those goals. And which were the constituencies that were going to talk about this? Was it just going to be a bit more of what we had done, or we were going to get other constituencies coming in? And I think that, the health constituency started off really quite slow in responding to this. But it began to be interrogated, and I know that Richard was on the end of much of that interrogation, and many more that really forced open discussions of health issues that perhaps people confined to what would be the developed world. And I think that, here many mistakes were made in excluding some of those discussions. So when we had discussions, for instance, about mental health, suddenly became apparent to everybody mental health was an issue the world over. It was an issue in the Pacific Islands when they came up for their Samoa compact pathway for it. It was an issue in the United States at one point. It was certainly a big issue, we suddenly realized, in post-conflict in the developing world. And this for us, opened up a number of issues about how did you address that? Was there the wherewithal? Did we understand enough about it? Could we have the answers for it now? Absolutely not. But we knew it had to be in the agenda. And that was these are some of the battles that we had, was people saying this didn't matter. If we put mental health in, it would be too much and we'd be overloading the health MDGs. And many argued other aspects of the agenda. Should we include adolescent girls in the health agenda? Absolutely, we should if this was to be a universal agenda, but it was argued that this was not important, it would overload it. Should we include context? Should the humanitarian context address the health, should be addressed in the health SDGs? It's still one that we're talking about now, and that's why I think when we come to talk about implementation, that's really where we have many more challenges to face than just getting the agenda we got. A tall road for this. So we agreed we'd all finish the MDG agenda. We have said that we've paid enormous attention to the indices, the systems that we need for this, and we have included much more. A universal health coverage so that every family has access. How does it get paid for? That was challenged in the financing framework, but we believe that there isn't an innovative financing framework that you cannot find to address the health sector as it should be. We have gone looking beyond Goal 3. In fact, the Secretary General's Every Woman, Every Child initiative, which looked at accelerating the MDGs, brought in context of the humanitarian, brought in the adolescents, but it also sort of put its goal there to saying that we could end preventable deaths for women and children by 2015 and 2030. Is that possible? Well, we will see. We believe it is. I think there's been enough discussion that people think if we put the investments in the right places, that we will get that. The goal itself is certainly dependent on other goals, but the reverse is also true. So we've argued with other goals that they've got to bring in the health discussion to those contexts. Focusing on reproductive, maternal, newborn, child, and adolescence will help to achieve the rest of the SDGs. We brought in the nutrition goal, which has been incredibly important in the later part of the MDG years, but how did it factor itself into the SDGs? We have looked again, I think, at the health care using technology. We learned a lot about technology, and yet not much of it was, in fact, surfacing at the beginning in this discussion. Again, tying in the technologies and innovations goal that we have, and to say if that was just isolated for the economy, what did it do for health, what did it do for education, and trying to find how we could justify that. SDGs, again, I think this has come from the scientific community, yet they took a big role in this, being accused the SDGs of being scientifically weak, unfeasible, non-evidence-based, not true. They have been evidence-based, and there's a lot of, I think, research that has gone into, in fact, now evaluating the SDGs, and I think the health SDG stands up to a lot of scrutiny. I think the real challenge that we're going to have is mobilizing the political will and the resources to make what is possible at the country level. Implementation at country level and local action. Here we know this is going to be the litmus test of 2030. The United Nations has been looked to. What is your strategy for implementation? How are you going to deal with this at the country level? What, in fact, are going to be the institutions that you put in place for that? First, implementation is going to primarily happen at the country level. It's important that we get the coherence and the alignment of country policies and plans with what we have in the SDGs. We hope that we will not take the SDGs to a country and ask them to do an SDG plan. That would be the beginning of failing. What we need is country visions and plans over the short and long term to integrate the SDGs. And then you will see domestic resources coming behind them. That's a litmus test for, in fact, financing the strategies. In the end, irreversible gains will come from domestic resource mobilization for this. We will need to leverage other resources in the first instance if we're looking at growing the economy, but essentially this is what's going to keep our goals going. At the country level, where the SDGs and targets will be adapted to, we need to face the concrete realities. We really need to see evidence really informing some of the priorities that countries would take. And I will come to some of the tools that we need for that. I think the second thing that we're going to be looking at is how it applies to all developed and developing countries. There's a lot of now discussion happening in Europe, in many other countries about what this means to them and their systems. It's uncomfortable for many leaders. I asked in the UK, what did you do in the process to define a revision of an education curriculum? How did you involve the community? And the answer was, well, we know what we're doing, and so there wasn't an answer. But yet, when we look at what we demand of developing countries to get the curriculum right, and then we end up with a primary education curriculum that has 13 subjects, we know something's wrong. And we have to come back to really addressing what are the priorities of a country at its time and at the level of its development. We cannot afford to say that we have a cookie cutter for countries, because we've done some research in a lab that is totally out of sync with the reality and context of many of our countries. We need to take those research, that evidence, and discuss that at the country level and engage people at the country level in taking those decisions. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda clearly articulates, and that's the financing one, clearly articulates country level policy, regulatory, and incentives that will be key to making investments work. Often when you're discussing with a Minister of Finance, the health budget and the education budget is really charity. And it's always about, you're lucky to get this percentage. And I think that that's going to have to change. They're going to have to look at leveraging, using resources that go into capital expenditures for growing the economy will have to be leveraged with other investments elsewhere, and really look at increasing the domestic resource budget for health and education. That has to be something that happens on a day-to-day basis. And we look at health and education budgets as a capital budget, as a budget that is a one investment will fix all. It needs to be really integrated into recurrent budgets. Our economic frameworks need to change the way we look at funding development. And I think this is probably going to be the biggest task our ministers of finance will look at, because when we started the discussion on financing, we talked about going from billions to trillions. And everyone said, how are we ever going to make that? Well, as I said, the resources are there. The financing framework for Addis Ababa is doable. And I think the bulk of the trillions do correspond to the investment in infrastructure that we will need to make over the next 15 years. The MDGs never talked about infrastructure. We all built primary health care centres. We didn't ask where the water came from. We didn't ask if there was power. We didn't look at an energy mix that had rural electrification that perhaps spoke to solar energy or wind energy that would survive in rural areas. We have to do that now, trying to green and be inclusive in our investment plans. We brought in a new partner for business investing in sustainable development to show that it's smart investing. There's a strong business case for that. There is a commission that is coming up for that, but the Global Compact, our platform for trying to bring business in, many champions for this agenda have started to engage with it in a way that they don't have to be dragged to the table thinking that this is just corporate social responsibility. The third is the implementation is going to require the active involvement of all stakeholders. How does this happen at the country level? What are the platforms available? And again, here, speaking to the United Nations, how do they help convene at the country level better than we have done before? What do we mean by multi-stakeholder today? In the health sector, it'll be yourselves talking to yourselves if we follow the business as usual. How do we bring in other stakeholders that matter to that agenda and identify them, not just for the one-off of considering what the priorities need to be in a community or a country, but constantly evaluating and responding to things that perhaps are going well that need to go to scale, or if they're not going well, how do you course correct before there's so much damage done? And so bringing in all stakeholders and not in silos. It will, in the beginning, sound like a cacophony, I can assure you. Our job is to try to get a symphony out of that for the sake of people and that we save more lives. The goals, targets, and indicators, again, at the local level, we will have a set of global indicators, but these need to be tailored to that local context. And many a time we will know that the capacities there are going to be lacking. So localizing development objectives will mean empowering people in their communities, in academic institutions, in public institutions like our governments, where much of the policy and implementation is done. And not to forget our parliaments. And when we talk about stakeholders, they will make the laws, they will do the appropriation, they will have oversight. But these are weak in many developing democracies, and we need to strengthen those and make sure that they're included and understand what we mean now by the new agenda. The operational framework for a lot of the discussions we've had took off in the health sector, and again, Richard, we've been part of that, when we looked at how we had the second version of the Every Woman, Every Child. And again, saying, do we have an operational plan that we just take down to the country and say, follow this roadmap? No, we need a guide that is applicable in many countries. And we saw consultations in South Africa, consultations in India, really taking root where far more had been done there than we ever imagined. But because we asked them to come and take the lead, we were getting a lot more upfront in terms of how they thought the operational plan should be articulated. And I hope that as we go through the first few months of the transition, here again, to just speak to you about transitions. Things can't happen overnight. We've got 17 goals, pretty good framework to follow, but it's going to take a while for us to move from where we were thinking in terms of development to this new paradigm of sustainable development, MDGs to the SDGs. I'm going to speak to two more things, indicators in the data revolution, and the experts, Claire is sitting on the corner there, and she's been with us all the way through this. If we say we don't want to leave anyone behind, who are they and where are they? The one thing that we don't have today is baseline data. We've got some data, but it's not enough. The disaggregated data that we need to reach everyone, to strengthen traditional institutions, to allow us to partner and to interface with big data, to get what we need in front of people to make the case for those investments is today not there. So when I talk about the transition, there's a lot to do with what's not there and what we need to have in place before we can even start to make those smart investments. It also will inform the work that's being done of, as I said, one of the knots that hasn't been tied is the work of the indicators. How are we going to measure all of this? And those global indicators are undergoing some pretty tough tests right now. I understand we have two versions of them, the ones that are okay and you can measure, and then the grey area where we say we can't measure. But I think we can measure almost anything and everything. But we do need the data revolution. It's something we've said right from the beginning. It requires a lot of investment. In the same way that we want to invest in routine immunization, we have to invest in routine data. It's got to be out there regularly. It's got to be updated. How do we involve everyone in trying to get that and use technology to help us get it in real time? So it is going to be an important part of selling the agenda for investments. And the interagency group that we have that is discussing the indicators, I hope there's still time now, because they don't come out until March next year, that in any way or form you engage and you interrogate some of the indicators that we have on health. We've had big arguments about how many we should have. I would say that we need global indicators that really open up the whole process for countries to develop a strong set of indicators and measures. It should be countries that are measuring their own development, and we get this up at the global level, exchange the lessons that we need to learn for that, but also course correct, make the case for more investments, and really use the global level to leverage what we need to make that work. Finally, the fit for purpose. This is really what we've spoken about in the United Nations over 2 years. We brought this up to say, if we really want to make this work, are we looking inwards to see have we got the tools and the skill sets to respond to this? Do we ourselves understand the Sustainable Development Agenda? Can we go down to the country level and respond to it? As of today, it's a work in progress. We will have an idea that the Secretary General will bring in terms of his strategy in the new year. But that's a question I think every constituency needs to ask itself. Because we have for so long worked in silos. What do we need to do to engage civil society, business, the donors, at the country level, different constituencies to do this? And I can tell you that in government, I know I certainly wasn't expecting to go to be in cabinet and very far from being in environment, but in 24 hours I've had to figure out what I'm going to do for the next 3.5 years with that. And being fit for purpose is a big part of it, because if we don't really look inwards and try to develop strong institutions, you look at the goals, the two goals that will hold up this agenda will be goals 16 and 17. That we have to have the rule of law, we have to have strong institutions to do this. And the second is the partnerships for it. How will we partner developing and developed countries to make sure that we have the asset base to carry this agenda through? The UN system is often blamed for being not being as effective as it could be on delivering assistance, and undoubtedly we're going to have to think about that. But the UN system is about our programs, it's about our agencies, but it's also about the member states that fund it. And we have to find somewhere, have an honest discussion about the way we fund things that don't chase what is perhaps just a flag or a fad for the day, that it really does address getting behind countries to make a difference with these goals. It is going to be an incredibly difficult part of this discussion. The universality of the agenda and being fit for purpose is also going to help us really interrogate what we're speaking about. The European Union, for the first time, is going to hold a consultation within Europe to talk about this agenda, and in every one of the sectors that they consider important. So, again, I would say engage with that and make sure that within the next year of this transition, and I think it'll be 2 years before we really get this rooted, but there are many opportunities to test this. We will have the indicators in March, but we will have a humanitarian summit in Turkey next year, and that will test whether we're going to get the SDGs discussed in this. I can tell you that on the migration discussion, as we looked at the SDGs, what we were saying was that let's look at the root causes. And if we're still going to put a Band-Aid on migration, forced migration, then we're going to get many more migrants here. We have to find a way to invest in the root causes. And if I look at my country and the northeast of it, I look to see what is my task for the SDGs. It's actually looking at the northeast of Nigeria, where Boko Haram has been a menace for us. A new government that comes in that wants to address conflict in ways of in taking care of the security, but also governance and corruption, which has exacerbated it, and then climate change. And if you look at the northeast of Nigeria today, you'll know that without Lake Chad, that has really taken away livelihoods. With the desert coming south 2 kilometers a year, that has compounded issues. But then we also had very weak institutions and governance. So corruption played a big part, where politicians really did create that hotbed for Boko Haram to evolve. And I think that it's important that if we could make sure that we build back after that, and we're very confident there'll be a day after Boko Haram, but it will slip back to Boko Haram if we don't take care of the inequalities, the governance, making sure that the education I got in that part of the country, everyone has a right to, and we're not looking at girls that are being kidnapped. But that means that it's not just about girls' education, it's about boys' education. It's about every child, and we say especially girls because they're usually marginalized, but it has to be about every child. Otherwise one will be left behind, and we will begin to deal with much of this now. We have a habitat conference next year at cities. What does global health look like in cities? And maybe that's a question for you. But I think for me, my litmus test now is to go back and look at the environmental agenda, but to really see how, as a member of cabinet, I can carry forward the work that we've done over this years, try to strengthen and redefine the partnerships that we have across the world to make this happen, to ask the uncomfortable questions. Not to just look for spaces where you say, I need Chatham House rules, because on the global common goods and human rights, there should be no Chatham House rules. This should be about our humanity, it should be about our core values, it should be about us saying that we have a right to develop, to aspire. Everyone has that right. And to exclude it to any one part of the world or the other, at the end of the day, in this, our world today, one way or another, we will pay for it. And I think that that's absolutely unnecessary, and that we do have now a framework that can make things, we can make a change. We can make a change that this generation becomes the first to end poverty, but it also is a big warning that it's the last generation to really make the difference of bending the curve on climate change. And climate change is very real. It is costing lives. It will cost many more, not just in the natural disasters we have, but also in the forced migration that you will see coming. Thank you for this opportunity, and I really look forward to hearing back from you. Yes.
So now it's those uncomfortable questions that Amina so relished that we have some time for over the next 20-25 minutes or so. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to take 3 or 4 questions at a time, and let me pour you some water too. And if you could say your name and where you're from, and if you look behind you, you'll see that there are two people in
Gentlemen,
I know. In purple shirts and with microphones. So please put your hands up and we'll get you. Right at the back.
Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. Lathan Bali, Medicine National Director. My question is regarding the fact that we've heard quite a lot about the role of governments so far, but this is about us all, as you identified. So what is the role of civil society in promoting accountability in the implementation of the SDGs?
Great question. So let me look over this side. Who'd like to ask a question on this side of the audience? Yes, please. Red T-shirt.
Thanks very much for an inspiring lecture. I suppose my question is more slightly, well, European-focused, I would say, but if we look at the recent horrendous coverage of migration and, you know, kind of the very negative publicity away from the idea of kind of global citizenship that you've been talking about. How do we really change that paradigm? Because in many ways, it seems like we're being forced in the other direction for many other different. And I just wondered if you have any suggestions on that.
That's a tough one. Anybody over here? Well, let's take. Oh yes, go on. Right at the very front. Fantastic.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. My name is Marta Roxburgh and I'm here from CARE UK. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Leave No One Behind agenda and the universality of the SDGs. Is there a risk by having universal goals and by talking about leaving no one behind that we actually do leave people behind, that it becomes too big of an agenda? And what do you see as the key things to make sure that we do not leave anyone behind?
Okay, well, let's kick off with those three questions. They're big issues. Civil society and accountability, global citizenship, and leaving no one behind.
Right, it's a life of dignity. Right, governments. The role of civil society. It's a difficult question in some countries today where civil society space is actually closing out. We believe we had a really huge, open and inclusive process, and bringing civil society in right to the end was something we never imagined our 193 states would tolerate. But having done that, we put the pressure on them to take back that as we define the indicators and the measures for civil society, for the framework itself, that the roles and responsibilities could also be defined in the follow-up and review mechanism that the member states have agreed with the high-level political forum, and really push to see how we can place civil society there. Ultimately, it will be at the country level, but countries need to look at the tools that they should shape, and should be an inclusive process with civil society for measuring. I think we need to be part of that baseline data process that we're talking about. Certainly, the National Assembly and parliaments in countries needs to be a place where civil society is really pushing, again, not for just what we're doing with the budgets, but the oversight function the parliaments have, that we have indicators across from public sector and civil society to ensure that they are the same that national assemblies will get behind. Often there is a tension between what parliaments do, who say they are elected to defend people's rights and they're there for representing people. I think civil society are often saying the same thing, and rightly so in some places where democracy is a work in progress. But I think we need to redefine that role, maybe get much more involved in the issues themselves and start to think through what measures you think would do that. My experience in Nigeria was that when we were looking to find a monitoring and evaluation framework, what we did with the debt relief, many Nigerians didn't believe we could spend it honestly, and so it was important that we were not in government the ones that measured and produced an M&E framework, because we would just produce it for the answers that we wanted, probably. So we involved civil society, and civil society were asked to do one thing: give us feedback on the effects that the investments made in people's lives. Did we deliver health to pregnant women and children under 5? Did actually we get portable water to people? And we did pair them up with more professional constituencies like our architects, our engineers, to say, did we get value for money? But we really wanted to see, did we actually do what we did with that? I think one of the clever things that we did was to say that the tools would not be designed by government. So we were allowing, yes, civil society should give us feedback, but we also asked you to design the tools. Word of caution there: to expect that civil society could do all that on fresh air is also unfair. Civil society don't often have the resources, particularly at the country level. They might have with international NGOs, but I can tell you at the local level they didn't. So that we needed to find some support that was independent, so that we could create this, really robust check and balance for them to do that. I think it's also going to be important for civil society to get involved in the planning the implementation plans and the strategies for this at the community level, there's not much capacity there either. And so to really make sure that you inform that when people are discussing with communities, they're not leaving out organized civil society to help them do that. There's very little there. On migration, tough question. The global citizen is being challenged. I think that there is a lot of mistrust, but there's also fear. When you are every day, the question of Syria, of the Arab world and ISIS and terrorism, Nigeria and Boko Haram, all that paints for you is that if you're getting migrants that are coming from those regions, then there would be fear. And I think that a lot of us are being tested for that in our governments. I don't think government is taking necessarily the right reactions. They've got very little time to respond because migrants are coming over the borders in hundreds and thousands, and it will get worse. But I think there have to be parallel discussions, one that really doesn't push back on stopping people coming across borders, but tries to find a way also to engage their own citizens in this discussion on migration. It appears to be a government discussion, and people, young people, citizens are not being as involved in it. When you have discussions in countries now in fora like this, very few have been engaged in the discussion of what is happening with migration. And I think that discussion has to happen at the local level. And a lot of it is a lack of knowledge, a lot of it is fear, and we have to deal with that. I think for us it's a leadership. I mean, you see a lot of challenges with leaders who are looking at the political implications of the decisions that they take. And perhaps what we need to do is step back a bit and think that those political implications may be short-term fixes, but in the long term, this is only going to get worse and much more expensive. We see some governments now taking resources from what they would have for development in countries now to take care of migrants that are coming across. This is only going to increase the flow because you're going to reduce what goes into investing in root causes, and you're just going to have people fleeing. Nobody wants to leave their country if they can stay. It really is not, I mean, there's been discussion about economic opportunity or conflict, but I can tell you many more people will stay if those opportunities are there. I think there has to be more engagement and demand of countries where migrants are originating and really be practical about some of the things that they can do to begin with. And then look at, helping others in transition. And of course, destination. It is, difficult for people to understand with the thousands that one is dealing with in Europe, and yet we're getting 8,000-9,000 migrants going across the border from Burundi into Tanzania, and nobody's asking Tanzania how they're coping. And here it is such a big issue. I mean, we really must, look at the question of the discussions around this, and this is where trust breaks down. And you have to have a discussion that is open to everyone that is facing this. The leave no one behind, and would we lose it because the agenda's so big? The agenda's become big because we left people behind. We decided to look at a band-aid approach to development, and so the crisis just increased, and it will continue to increase. Somewhere along the line, we just got to bite it off and deal with it. It's uncomfortable, it will take a long time, it is not pigeonholed and neat, because the world just isn't very neat right now. I'm leaving my country yesterday evening, and I was looking at the screen, and I'm just Minister of Environment. The first thing they tell me is that the Ogoni people in the Niger Delta are reacting to the oil spills and the cleanup in their area, and a very, very, a reaction that could spiral out of control. And they're justified in in wanting to react because they can no longer continue to live in that state. And so if I don't take climate change into account, if I don't take the responsibilities of keeping our environments in a way in which people can live there into account, then really I'm just looking for trouble down the road. So I do think that it is worthwhile looking at this agenda and believing that this is the opportunity we have in a lifetime. We're always talking about that if we don't do it at this crossroad, it's never going to work. We can probably come back to this again in 15 years and try, but it's going to be a lot more expensive. And I can assure you that in lives, we would have lost so many more, and people will be in dire straits more than we can say today. So I think the time to really address this is now. We've got the wherewithal. There's nothing stopping us except the political will and the leadership to do it. And when we talk about leadership, Richard, it's actually leadership at all levels. It's about what you and I do on a day-to-day basis, what all of you do here to commit yourself to doing that and to stand up and be counted.
So let's go back to the audience. Other questions? Yes, please, here, and then Georgina here, and then we've got loads of you now. So let's start off. There was, yes, you on the, keep your hand up so the microphone can find you. That's great, fantastic. And then down in the front with Georgina Mace, please. Thank you.
Sam Mardell, the London International Development Centre. I'm interested in Amina's opinion on what the appetite among richer countries is to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly in relation to climate change.
Very good, thank you. Professor Georgina Mace.
Thank you. I'm Georgina Mace from UCL. Yeah, thank you for the lecture. So you talked a lot about implementation by governments within nation states, but you've also talked a lot about these issues in the global commons, the atmosphere, climate change, there's the oceans and so on. And I'm curious about the extent to which the goals can be met as a coherent group without some attention to these issues beyond nation states, i.e. that require some collaboration or understanding between countries. And, you know, to what extent you think that is going to be a problem and how that can be supported through the UN system.
Thank you very much. Those gentlemen here.
Hi, Tim Coburn, also at UCL. I've got a question about joined-up government thinking. So you very rightly said that the SDGs should be a focus of the whole government budget rather than just a part of it, which is great. But I'm just wanting to hear more about kind of your ideas for mechanisms for making government departments work together rather than at cross purposes. So perhaps an example which you just talked about would be in the Delta with the oil industry and the people's rights and environment. So.
Let me just look over this side of the room. Anybody over here got a burning question? Gentleman right at the back.
Thank you. Alex Murray, also from UCL. I'm interested in your views as to what works best, the carrot or the stick?
Okay. Let's come back to you here, Amina.
Okay. The appetite for the climate change agenda, I think we're being tested right now on that. The negotiations as they have gone have been really different from what's happened in the post-2015. It's a different environment with the negotiators and with the political leadership. I think what the Secretary General has managed to do is to get an awful lot of political leadership behind some of the decisions that are coming out of China, the US, Europe, and in a way that we think we can make that agenda work. As we look at the text for the negotiation, you begin to see a negotiating mindset that perhaps won't allow us to get that ambition. There's a lot of work being done in different ways to try to make that as responsive, make the negotiators respond to the agenda in a way that we can get the ambition. The ambition is what is lacking in it. I think we have got the elements. Clearly, the INDCs, which are countries' responses to what they would do to reduce emissions, have been really forthcoming, and we're happy to see the level at which they're coming in. A lot more needs to be done, and that's not going to solve the problem. But I think what has made for an interesting discussion is how we've hinged the success of the SDGs on a good climate outcome. And there's much more pressure now on that because there's been so much commitment behind the SDGs. There's a lot of discussion and tensions around the financing. Again, that people are looking to the public purse. Our partners, certainly donors, don't feel that those resources are available. But I think if we look at some of the investments that we're looking at, how can we bring other parts and innovative financing in? Even the capacity to spend some of the funds that are around might help. So I'm hopeful that we're going to get a good outcome in Paris. But I think it's going to be really a big hill to climb, that last one. I think we can leverage a lot of actions afterwards if we can really get money behind all of the SDGs and the climate change, the 3 goals that we have there for the environment. and climate change, I think we see a lot of those investments in other ones, in cities, in innovation, in energy. All of them are integrated, and that discussion doesn't seem to have happened enough. We're still thinking silos. So if the climate change discussion doesn't happen, that climate change goal doesn't happen, then everything falls apart. I think there's still lots of the climate change discussion in all the other goals, and we've got to just hold on to those and push the framework as a response to it. On the priorities and the partnerships, again, I mean, ultimately governments have got to be responsible for delivering to their people. That's what they're there for. And if they, if government doesn't work, then we should just scrap them. I don't know anybody who's looking to scrap government. So we've got to make them work. And I think we're always taking it's not working, so we need to go and do something else. We have to make government work, and that's about strengthening the institutions, making sure that we have those capacities available to do it. There are some things government shouldn't be doing, and that's where the partnerships come in. And having more robust partnerships that have checks and balances, because we have talked about business as partnerships, but the clear message from civil society is that sometimes is an unholy alliance, and it is to the detriment of people and their communities. So I think we need to make sure that that's sound. The priority setting in governments is going to be important, and that has to be inclusive. Again, if I speak again to Tim, you talked about joined up government and maybe these two questions come together. Again, the transition itself needs to be understood. Where is the entry point to make this come together? It is, in fact, the plan. Countries' visions and plans will be the entry point. And that has to have the budget behind it. In many cases, our countries have got the Ministry of Finance and Budget, and then they have the Ministry of Development and Planning. And so development and planning becomes a toothless bulldog. And finance and budget ends up having the plan running after it. And finance and budget is what the parliaments are interested in. And so it then becomes about, in many cases, their interests, which there's a huge disconnect with the vision and plan of the country. In many cases, the countries themselves, our democracies, are 4-year cycles, 5-year cycles perhaps. It's only in extreme cases you might get them for 20, 30 years. But by and large, the fast turnover of governments in cases where we don't have good foundations is also works to the detriment of seeing any progress in development. So if we could see plans that align themselves and integrate the SDGs legislated over a period of 15 years, you would then see in a country a roadmap that everyone would follow. Whatever government of the day could take their set of priorities, their branding, and move with it. But the lack of that is that we continuously throw the baby out with the bathwater every time we come to another 4 years or another 5 years of government. What we're trying to do now, if I take the environment agenda, as I got that yesterday, I looked at the change agenda, the manifesto of the political party that I now belong to, as of yesterday, and trying to see where does the environment fit into this. Now, the words environment and climate change don't appear. So how do I bring them into it? But you can see that climate change and the environment affect so many of the other goals. So if you want renewable energy, or we want to talk about power and moving from fossil fuels to renewables, then this agenda is going to play a part of it. So it's really trying to find ways of, first of all, communicating that climate change and environment are an integral part of this, and then trying to make sure that our plan, which today stands at Vision 2020, we can raise that bar, and maybe other countries can do the same as well. But it really does have to be the plan. The budget has to be behind the plan, and then we have to find the resources for it. On the carrot and stick, I see the carrot as incentives, incentives that really will deliver on specific results. We've had this in many cases where we've thought we couldn't get people to come to the table and to deliver where they had responsibilities. I think the stick is really about strengthening institutions and people knowing that there are consequences for actions they take. But without strengthening the institutions, then perhaps the penalty itself has no effect because you just can't do it. And I think for people to see that it is in their own vested interest is the incentive that you will see, the less of the stick. I think it doesn't always work. I think it's the same as, do we need a law? But enforcing the law becomes really quite difficult in many of our circumstances. But if you can get a plan together or an agreement from constituencies that are very difficult, that they own and that they can find something in it for them, then it works. Quick example of this was that in our country, many of our parliamentarians felt very seriously that to come to the federal level, the national level, from the communities and go back with nothing that they can touch and feel in the 4 years that they are there was just non-negotiable. But what they wanted to do within the budgets was also out of sync with the rule of law for which they were responsible. So what we tried to do was to find a framework where we could budget resources that they could touch and feel the dividends of democracy in their communities, and that they participated in the budget, but also in the plans and choosing where those priorities went in consultation with their own communities. So I think we can find ways of finding that balance. There's no, as they say, there's no fixed framework for that. I think we just have to have those discussions and know that there are very real realities of the political economy and some of the contingencies. The global arena needs carrot and stick too. And, that's more difficult. So when we talked about illicit flows and how much resources were being taken out, and there was clearly a partnership or collusion between the two, whether we in developed and developed countries, multinationals, how would we find the carrot and stick there? On the one hand was transparency, and that's, the first step. But if I am today to know and have a list of all the countries and the institutions that hold illicit flows and those that evade taxes, it's one thing to know where they are, it's another thing to get them back. And I think often we spend years knowing where they are and not being able to get hold of them. And so I think there really has to be much more political will, again, and leadership to say, well, if this is where they are, where the resources are, they need to come back. Having said that, we also need investment in the countries where they went out to begin with to make sure that we shore up those holes so that we're not just putting things back into a system that they will go out again.
Fantastic. I think that time is against us and we're going to have to draw this wonderful evening to a close. I'd like to just emphasize a couple of things to connect what you said this evening with this institution of UCL. At the very beginning of your talk, you talked about don't forget the reality. It's very easy when you get wrapped up in 17 goals and texts and negotiations to forget the reality of people's lived experiences. And the university, its scholarship, its research is a fantastic vehicle to communicate those realities to a larger audience. That's the second point that you really emphasized, and that was about communication. And again, the university is a fantastic platform to transmit and amplify the messages that you've talked about this evening to not just the larger public, but also to policymakers and decision makers. And the third point that I really want to stress is that we mustn't talk to ourselves. It's very easy to talk to ourselves. You really stressed that in your talk. And again, the university, and UCL has done this very well, how to bring different constituencies together to talk with one another and to learn from one another. You've done so much to come this evening to London, to be with us, to speak with us at a moment of huge personal change for you. I want all of us to show our appreciation for what you've done by coming here and for all you've achieved in the last 3 years. It's been truly magnificent. Amina Mohammed. Drinks in the